By the time the 50th young woman smiled at Duke Julian Ravenshaw as if nothing in England could possibly be more fascinating than whatever he was about to say. Julian had begun to suspect that marriage might be considerably less exhausting if conducted by correspondence. Ravenshaw Hall had been transformed for the summer ball. Chandeliers illuminated the polished floor, musicians filled the gallery with a graceful waltz. And nearly every ambitious family within a day's journey had discovered that the 40-year-old Duke of Ravenshaw possessed three qualities that made society unusually forgiving of his reluctance to marry: an ancient title, an enormous estate, and no heir. His mother called the gathering modest. Julian counted 50 eligible women before deciding she had either lost the ability to count or had developed a highly creative understanding of the word. He did not dislike the women themselves. Several were intelligent, most were perfectly pleasant, and none deserved the private impatience building inside him. What wearied Julian was watching them change whenever he approached. A young lady who had spent 10 minutes enthusiastically discussing Italian opera suddenly announced. Another claimed to adore country life despite having complained only moments earlier about the mud on her slippers. During a conversation about Parliament, one woman actually altered her opinion halfway through a sentence when she realized Julian disagreed. They had been taught to become whatever an eligible man required. And because Julian was a duke, almost everyone seemed especially determined to please him. Lord Henry Vale appeared beside him, holding 2 glasses of champagne, and followed his gaze across the ballroom. 50 women, Ravenshaw, he murmured. Surely one of them must have managed to interest you. Julian accepted the glass but barely touched it. At present, I find them considerably more interested in me than I am capable of being in myself. Henry laughed. That level of ingratitude would devastate half the mothers in this room. Then I should leave before it becomes a diplomatic incident. Before Henry could stop him, Julian slipped away during the next dance and crossed into the quiet eastern corridor. He intended only to find 10 minutes without marriage, music, or anyone pretending to enjoy his opinions. The old library seemed the obvious refuge. Julian opened the door expecting darkness. Instead, he found Eleanor Wren. He knew the name better than the woman. Miss Wren had managed Ravenshaw's estate library for several years, preserving an old family tradition that allowed schoolteachers, servants, tenants, and villagers to borrow books on certain days. Julian approved the modest expense every quarter, occasionally signed an order for new volumes, and had otherwise regarded the library as one of those useful institutions that functioned perfectly well without requiring his attention. Eleanor stood behind the main desk with a boy Julian recognized as Thomas Reed, the 11-year-old son of one of his stable hands. 2 large books lay between them. If you are interested in ships themselves, begin with this one, Eleanor was explaining. The other is mostly navigation, and unless you've developed a sudden affection for mathematics, it may disappoint you. Thomas frowned seriously at the second book. Does the first one have maps? 7, if I remember correctly, and one of them is large enough to unfold across your mother's entire kitchen table, which she may not consider an advantage. The boy grinned. Julian approached the desk. Eleanor looked up and saw him immediately. She gave the smallest acknowledgement with her eyes before returning to Thomas. Julian stopped. Thomas asked another question. Eleanor answered. Julian waited. There was nothing openly disrespectful about it, yet the situation felt so unfamiliar that he initially assumed he had misunderstood. Whenever Julian entered a room, conversations usually shifted, people moved, chairs appeared. And whatever had been considered important a moment earlier somehow became less urgent. Eleanor Wren merely continued helping a stable boy choose a book. After nearly 2 minutes, Julian finally said, Miss Wren. She glanced toward him. One moment, Your Grace. Thomas is nearly finished. Thomas immediately noticed who was waiting behind him and went pale. I can come back tomorrow, miss. You walked almost 2 miles after work to come today, Eleanor replied. Choose your book. The boy looked helplessly toward Julian. Julian, now more curious than offended, gave a slight nod. Thomas selected the volume with the maps. Eleanor entered his name in the lending ledger, reminded him to keep the book away from stable lanterns, and watched until he disappeared through the door. Only then did she turn toward Julian properly. "Your Grace, how may I help you?" Julian studied her for a moment. She was perhaps 34, dressed in a simple dark blue gown with no jewelry beyond a small watch at her waist. Her brown hair was neatly pinned, her manner composed, and nothing in her expression suggested she had delayed him deliberately to make a point. That somehow made it more interesting. "You knew who I was when I came in." "Of course. And yet you allowed me to wait." A hint of amusement appeared in her eyes. "Thomas arrived before you." Julian glanced toward the door the boy had used. "This is my library." "The building belongs to you, certainly." That sounded dangerously like the beginning of a distinction. "It is only a practical one. When you entered, Thomas was already being helped." Your title did not make his question disappear. Julian almost objected but found himself smiling instead. "So you considered the stable boy's time more important than mine?" "No. I considered it equally real." That answer silenced him for a moment. Julian had spent the evening surrounded by people willing to abandon their opinions the instant they discovered his. Eleanor had just made him wait behind the son of a stable hand and seemed to find it perfectly normal. "You might have asked him to return tomorrow," he said. "I might have, but he had already worked all day and walked here just for that. You, on the other hand, seemed to be escaping a ballroom." Julian stared at her. "How could you possibly know that? The music is still playing, Your Grace, and you look far more relieved than a man merely seeking literature." He laughed before he could stop himself. Eleanor returned to the ledger as if making a duke laugh was as ordinary as issuing a book. That was when Julian noticed several architectural plans spread out on a nearby table. He recognized them immediately. The East Wing renovations. Eleanor's hand paused. "Yes." Julian moved toward the plans. "Work begins after the summer. The new reception gallery should finally solve the issue of hosting large political gatherings without using the central hall. And this room." He unfolded one of the sheets. "This space becomes part of the new gallery." Eleanor was silent long enough that Julian looked at her. "You disapprove?" "I am trying to understand what happens to the people who use the library now." "The books will still exist." "Upstairs?" "Yes. In the private section of Ravenshaw Hall." Imagine Thomas returning next week. Instead of walking through that door and browsing the shelves, he must approach the main entrance. Explain to a footman that he wants a book, hope he remembers the correct title, wait for someone to retrieve it. And then return again if it happens to be the wrong one. Julian considered the sequence. "When you describe it like that, it sounds unnecessarily complicated." "It is unnecessarily complicated." Her answer was not sharp, but it carried enough certainty to make him look at the library differently. Until that moment, Julian had regarded the room as several thousand books occupying valuable ground floor space. Eleanor apparently regarded it as something else entirely. "The books would remain available," he said. "Availability and permission are not the same thing." Julian folded the architectural drawing. "What does that mean?" "It means people behave differently when they must ask a powerful household for access to something they could previously reach themselves. Some will ask anyway. Others simply stop coming." He glanced around the quiet room, remembering Thomas standing at the desk with his book about ships. If the library matters this much, why has no one objected to the plans? Eleanor met his gaze. Would it have changed them? The question caught him. "I asked why no one complained. And I am asking whether you had left room for complaint." Julian's expression tightened slightly. Eleanor did not retreat, but neither did she seem interested in defeating him. She simply said, "People rarely argue with a man after they believe he has already decided." For several seconds, the ballroom music drifting faintly down the corridor was the only sound between them. Julian had escaped that room because 50 young women seemed determined to tell him whatever they believed he wished to hear. In the library, he had encountered a woman who had no apparent interest in his approval at all. More strangely, Julian found that he did not want her approval. He wanted her argument. A new dance began somewhere beyond the closed doors, and Julian knew his mother would soon notice his absence. 50 eligible women remained beneath his chandeliers, all hoping that before the night ended he might choose to look at one of them differently. Yet as Julian returned reluctantly toward the ballroom, his thoughts remained with Eleanor Wren and the quiet room behind him. She had made him wait for a stable boy. She had questioned a decision he had already approved. And she had done both without once behaving as though defying a duke were remarkable. For the first time in years, Julian began to wonder how many things on his own estate he had failed to see simply. Because everyone around him had learned that agreeing with him was easier than asking him to look again. Julian returned to the library the following afternoon with a reason prepared. At least, that was what he told himself. He had spent breakfast reviewing the renovation plans again and had discovered that Eleanor's objection was more irritating once he understood it. The architect's proposal was elegant, practical, and expensive enough to impress every guest who entered Ravenshaw Hall. On paper, moving the books upstairs seemed to change very little. The collection would remain intact, the building would still have a library, and anyone who truly needed a volume could request it. Yet Julian couldn't stop imagining Thomas standing at the front entrance, trying to explain to a footman that he wanted a book about ships. So he went downstairs. Eleanor was kneeling beside a low shelf when he entered, helping an elderly tenant find a farming manual whose title the man couldn't remember. Julian waited near the door without announcing himself. Eleanor eventually looked over and noticed him. "You are improving, Your Grace. I have been here less than a minute, and no one has been displaced on your behalf." Julian smiled despite himself. A remarkable achievement. Only after the tenant left did Eleanor approach him, and Julian explained that he wanted to understand how the library was actually used before approving any further alterations. "Recently, you." For the next hour, Eleanor showed him a version of Ravenshaw Hall he had never seen. A village teacher borrowed geography books because the school owned only one atlas. A widow came every Tuesday to read newspapers she couldn't afford to purchase. 2 kitchen maids were teaching themselves arithmetic because they hoped to eventually manage household accounts. One tenant brought official notices to Eleanor because the language used by lawyers frightened him more than the contents themselves. Julian watched her explain a document without making the man feel foolish for needing help, and something about that stayed with him. When they were alone again, he asked, "Do people come here for books or because they know you will explain things?" "Both." "That sounds less like a library and more like half the functions of a village clerk." Eleanor replaced several papers in a drawer. Knowledge becomes considerably less useful if the person holding it enjoys reminding everyone else that they do not. Julian leaned against the desk. "You have a low opinion of people who enjoy authority." "I have a low opinion of authority that enjoys itself too much." He laughed. Their conversations began to stretch beyond the library. Julian found himself arriving near closing time with books he had no urgent reason to borrow. Eleanor entered his name into the ledger exactly as she did everyone else's. The first time she asked, "Name?" Julian stared at her. "You know my name." "I do." "The ledger does not." "Duke Julian Ravenshaw." She wrote it down without looking impressed. "Residence." He glanced around his own library. Eleanor finally smiled. "All right. I will permit you that one." He began reading more simply because returning a book gave him an excuse to bring another. They argued about Shakespeare, history, education, and whether authors became wiser with age or merely more confident in repeating themselves. Eleanor never disagreed just for show, and she never softened her opinion just because Julian frowned. Within 3 weeks, Julian decided the library would stay open. He did more than that. The East Wing plans were revised so the collection could remain on the ground floor. Julian authorized new shelves, better lamps, window repairs, more reading tables, and a significant budget for new books. He even instructed the architect to enlarge the room slightly by removing an unused adjoining parlor. When he called Eleanor to review the proposal, he expected resistance to end in gratitude. Instead, she read the first page and became very quiet. Julian recognized that silence now. "What's wrong?" Eleanor turned the plan toward him. Across the top in ornate lettering was the architect's proposed name, the Ravenshaw Reading Hall. Below it was space reserved for a large portrait of Julian. He frowned. "The architect suggested it. And you approved it." "I didn't consider the name especially important." Eleanor continued reading. Then she found the second problem. On days when Ravenshaw Hall hosted political dinners, balls, or major guests, public access would be suspended so the library could be reserved for visitors. She placed the document down. You've preserved the room and changed the reason it exists. Julian's patience tightened. I'm spending a considerable amount of money to keep it open. I know. Then I confess, I expected slightly more enthusiasm. Eleanor looked at him carefully. This library survives because Thomas Reed can walk through the door without questioning if he belongs here. If we rename it after you and hang your portrait over the entrance, and close it whenever important people arrive, we've told him exactly whose presence matters more. Julian straightened. It is my estate. My family pays for the building. And that is precisely why no one needs reminding. The words stung because he had thought himself generous. Without my support, this place could eventually close. Eleanor's expression changed. Not anger. Disappointment. Then let it survive because people need it, Your Grace. Not because they are expected to admire the man who paid for it. For once, Julian had no desire to laugh. He ended the meeting too abruptly. Unfortunately, society had already begun noticing how often the Duke disappeared into the East Wing. By the end of the week, one of the remaining house party guests had joked that Ravenshaw's greatest romantic strategy was apparently borrowing books. Days later, a London society paper printed a playful paragraph about the provincial librarian, who had captured a duke's attention by refusing to give him hers. The article spread quickly. Visitors began entering the library for no reason except to look at Eleanor. One young woman asked loudly whether Julian preferred ladies who pretended not to notice him. Another remarked that Miss Wren had discovered an unusually clever way for a woman of modest position to distinguish herself from 50 competitors. Eleanor endured it for 2 days. On the third, Julian heard the comment himself. His anger was immediate. Enough. The room fell silent. Julian looked directly at the guests. Miss Wren is under my protection. Any insult directed toward her will be regarded as an insult to Ravenshaw. The effect was exactly what he intended. No one laughed again. Julian believed the matter finished. Eleanor did not. She found him that evening in his study. Your protection? Julian looked up. I was defending you. By telling everyone that insulting me is wrong because it offends you. That is not what I said. It is what they heard. He rose. I would prefer you corrected their behavior without turning me into another possession attached to your name. Julian stared at her. That is unfair. Perhaps. But I did not refuse to bow to your title simply to become respectable because your title now protects me. He felt the conversation slipping somewhere he did not want it to go. Eleanor, I was trying to help. Her face softened, which somehow made the next words worse. I know. She placed an envelope on his desk. Julian looked at it. What is this? My notice. The room seemed suddenly too quiet. A subscription library in Wexford has offered me a position. I have accepted. Julian's first emotion was disbelief. You would leave Ravenshaw? I would leave a place where I am becoming a story about you instead of a woman doing my work. And everything I have been trying to do for this library. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. That is exactly the problem. Julian's expression hardened. I never asked you to do it for me. The words were calm, but they struck with more force than anger could have managed. Eleanor bowed, then turned toward the door. Julian almost called her back. Almost told her that she was making a mistake, that Ravenshaw could give her more resources than any small-town subscription library ever could. That she was walking away from everything he had just spent weeks trying to preserve. But beneath all those arguments sat an uncomfortable truth. Every solution Julian had offered still placed him at the center of Eleanor's life. Even his generosity had asked her to orbit him. The door closed behind her. For the first time since entering that library weeks earlier, Julian understood that making a woman stay could be very different from giving her a reason to want to. For the first week after Eleanor left Ravenshaw, Julian was angry enough to convince himself that her departure proved she had been unreasonable all along. He had preserved the library she loved, approved repairs she could never have afforded, and publicly defended her when society turned her into entertainment. If Eleanor had chosen to interpret every gesture as another form of control, then perhaps there was nothing he could have done to satisfy her. That explanation lasted until the new librarian arrived. Mr. Pembury was competent, courteous, and so determined to respect Julian's rank that he stood every time the Duke entered the room. If Julian asked about a book, Pembury abandoned whatever he was doing to assist him immediately. If a tenant happened to be waiting, the tenant was politely moved aside. Whenever Julian offered an opinion about the collection, Mr. Pembury agreed before Julian had finished speaking. It was everything Julian had once considered proper. Within 10 days, he could barely tolerate it. One afternoon, he entered while an elderly woman was asking for help with a letter from her landlord. Julian looked at the woman still standing beside the desk. "You were assisting her. She will not mind waiting." The old woman lowered her eyes at once. Julian felt an unpleasant memory surface. "I considered his time equally real." "Finish," he said. Pembury hesitated. "Your Grace, finish helping her. I can wait." The old woman looked surprised. So did Julian. He walked toward the shelves while Pembury returned awkwardly to the letter. That was when Julian noticed that Thomas Reed had not been in the library for several days. He asked about him later. Pembury explained that the boy had come once but left after finding several areas temporarily closed for renovation. He had not returned. Neither had some of the kitchen maids who once borrowed arithmetic books. The village teacher still visited, though less often, and several tenants had begun sending servants to request books instead of entering the increasingly formal room themselves. The library was becoming more beautiful. It was also becoming less used. Julian stood beneath the empty section of wall where the architect intended to hang his portrait, and finally saw the room as Eleanor must have seen it. New shelves, better lamps, fine tables, and everywhere, quiet reminders that the Duke of Ravenshaw had improved it. He returned to his study and summoned the architect. "The portrait is removed from the plan." The man blinked. "Your Grace. And the name? The Ravenshaw Reading Hall?" "It remains the village library." The architect shuffled through his papers. "There is also the question of access during major functions. It stays open. But when Parliament guests are in residence, then Parliament guests may learn to coexist with people borrowing books." Within a week, every change Eleanor had objected to was removed. Julian did not write to tell her. That restraint was harder than the alterations themselves. His mother discovered the revisions over breakfast. "I thought Miss Wren had accepted another position." "She has." "Then why are you still changing the plans to suit her?" Julian folded the newspaper. "Because she was right before. I wanted her back." His mother studied him for a long moment. "That sounds inconvenient." "It has been an inconvenient summer. Are you going after her?" Julian considered the question. Eventually he said, "Not until I can distinguish wanting her back from wanting her where I left her." For nearly 2 months, he did nothing. Then, one rainy afternoon, Julian travelled to Wexford. The subscription library occupied a modest brick building near the market square. There were no marble columns, ancestral portraits, or uniformed footmen at the library. Inside, the room smelled faintly of paper, damp coats, and coal smoke. Eleanor stood near a window, helping an elderly gentleman read a letter. She looked up when Julian entered. Their eyes met. He almost walked toward her. Instead, he stopped beside the door. The gentleman continued speaking. Eleanor returned her attention to him, although Julian noticed that she was suddenly holding herself more carefully. 1 minute passed. Then 2. Eventually, the man thanked her and left. Eleanor approached. "You waited." Julian removed his gloves. "I have been practicing." A reluctant smile touched her mouth. That small victory felt absurdly important. He reached inside his coat and produced a book. Eleanor recognized it immediately. "You still have that." "I believe it belongs to Ravenshaw." "It belonged to Ravenshaw 4 months ago." Julian looked appropriately concerned. "How serious is the penalty?" Eleanor went behind the desk and opened the ledger. "Severe enough to humble a duke." "That may require considerable money." It requires 3 shillings. Julian placed the coins on the desk. Devastating. Eleanor almost laughed. Almost. Then the distance between them returned. You did not travel 2 hours to pay a library fine. No. Julian became serious. I came to apologize properly. Eleanor said nothing, so he continued. When you refused to vie for my attention, I turned that refusal into another tale about myself. I found you intriguing because you didn't care that I was a duke. And then I spent weeks using that very title to meddle with your work. Her expression stayed guarded. When people mocked you, I thought attaching my name to yours would shield you. I didn't realize I was making your respectability reliant on me. Eleanor glanced down briefly. And the library? The portrait is gone. So is the new. It will remain open during political gatherings, and public access is included in the revised plans rather than depending on whoever inherits Ravenshaw. After me. Her eyes lifted. You changed all of that. Yes. Why didn't you tell me? Julian could have answered, because I hoped you would come back. Instead, he gave her the truth. Because if I only did the right thing so you would see me doing it, then I had learned very little. For several seconds, Eleanor simply looked at him. That silence no longer frightened him. Finally, Julian asked, "May I call on you?" The question seemed to surprise her more than the apology. "You are asking?" "I am attempting another new habit." Eleanor considered him, then nodded. "You may." Relief washed over him, but she wasn't finished. "If someone arrives before you, Your Grace, you will have to wait." This time, Julian smiled without reservation. "I expected as much." He left Wexford without asking Eleanor to return to Ravenshaw. For the first time since meeting her, he wasn't trying to pull her into his world. He was asking if she might let him slowly into hers. Julian's courtship of Eleanor started without any of the advantages he once thought came with being Duke of Ravenshaw. He couldn't summon her to dinner because she no longer worked on his estate. He couldn't arrange his schedule and expect hers to revolve around it. If he arrived at the Wexford Library while Eleanor was helping a teacher, a tenant, or a child, Julian sat beneath the window and waited until she was free. To his surprise, he found that waiting became easier once he stopped seeing it as a loss of importance. Their conversations changed too. At Ravenshaw, nearly every disagreement had an unspoken question beneath it: who had the authority to decide? In Wexford, there was no such question. Eleanor could tell him he misunderstood a book, challenge his views on education, or decline an invitation without the slightest worry about contradicting the man who paid her salary. Julian found he liked her that way. One afternoon, after he spent half an hour listening to Eleanor argue that a popular history book admired by half of London was 300 pages of confident nonsense, he asked if she realized how rarely anyone spoke to him so freely. Eleanor closed the book in question. "That sounds less like a compliment to me and more like criticism of everyone around you." "It may be both." "Then you are improving." He smiled. "I should have known you would find a way to make my progress sound disappointing." "I would hate for praise to make you complacent." Those small exchanges became the foundation of something neither of them needed to name immediately. Julian visited Wexford because he wanted to see Eleanor, but he began knowing the other people in her world as well. And once spent 20 minutes beside an elderly schoolmaster who did not recognize him until the conversation was nearly finished. When the man finally realized he had been criticizing a Ravenshaw estate policy directly to the Duke of Ravenshaw, he went pale. Julian only said, "You seemed more comfortable before you knew my name. Continue." When Eleanor heard about it, she laughed for so long that Julian decided the embarrassment had been worth it. By winter, neither of them could reasonably pretend affection had not become love. Yet when Julian finally spoke of marriage, Eleanor did not answer immediately. They were walking along the river outside Wexford when he said quietly, "I would like a future with you." Eleanor stopped. She did not look frightened by him. She looked frightened by what loving him might do to the life she had fought to keep. "If I marry you," she said, "I become Duchess of Ravenshaw." Julian waited. "And eventually people stop seeing Eleanor Wren. They see your wife. Your name enters every room before mine does. That does not have to happen." It will happen whether either of us intends it. Julian almost said she could keep working if she wanted to. The old him would have thought that was generous. He now realized why that would be the wrong thing to say. So he asked, "What would marriage to me need to be like for you not to lose yourself in it?" Eleanor stared at him. No man had ever asked her that. She thought carefully before answering. She wanted to keep working with libraries. She wanted the Wexford position to stay hers as long as she wanted it. If she helped set up reading rooms on Ravenshaw land, they would belong to the communities, not bear her husband's name. As tributes to his generosity. And she didn't want every disagreement to be a private embarrassment to fix before society. Julian listened. When she finished, he said, "That sounds perfectly reasonable." Eleanor narrowed her eyes. "You agree awfully fast. I'm trying to avoid another 4-month library fine." That made her smile, but she still didn't say yes. Julian didn't push. Several weeks later, he went into the Wexford Library and found Eleanor helping a young girl pick between 2 books. The child noticed Julian and immediately stepped aside. "Your Grace can go first." Julian shook his head. "No. You were here first." The girl hesitated. Julian gestured toward Eleanor. "Finish choosing." Eleanor looked up. Something in her expression changed. Months earlier, she had refused to leave Thomas just because a duke had entered the room. Now Julian had become the one upholding that principle without needing a reminder. When the girl finally left with her book, Eleanor approached him. "You know," she said, "you don't have to wait every time. I understand." "Then why do you?" Julian looked at her. "Because the first thing you taught me was that another person's time doesn't become less valuable just because mine belongs to a duke." Her eyes softened. Julian reached into his coat but didn't take anything out yet. "May I ask for some of yours?" Eleanor knew exactly what he meant. This time, when he proposed, he didn't ask her to enter the life he had already designed. He asked if they might build one together. Eleanor said yes. Months later, after their marriage, she continued working with the libraries she had helped preserve and expand. Society called her the Duchess of Ravenshaw, as she had always known it would. But the people who came through the reading room doors still called her Miss Wren often enough to make Julian smile. One afternoon at Ravenshaw, Julian entered the old estate library and found Eleanor helping Thomas with another book about ships. Thomas immediately began to move aside. Julian stopped him. "You were here first." Eleanor looked up at once, not because a duke had entered, but because Julian had. And for the first time, he understood that being noticed freely was worth infinitely more than being obeyed automatically.